All right there, Gen Bio. Welcome to Chapter 4. We have a chapter, an entire chapter on a single element, which should probably tell you that carbon's kind of a big deal. It's kind of a big deal because living organisms consist mainly of carbon-based compounds, right? Carbon is unparalleled in its ability to form large, complex, and varied molecules, and we'll look at why that is. So carbon makes things like proteins and carbohydrates, other big molecules that really distinguish living matter. When we look at carbon, though, you might think, so carbon's the black sphere in the center of this, and you say, well, what makes carbon so special, right? Why is this the element that life is based on? And so we're really delving into then organic chemistry. This is the study of compounds that contain carbon. And technically, it's carbon and hydrogen. So these organic compounds, these carbon-based compounds, range really from very simple molecules to these huge complex things like a protein. And it really comes down to carbon's ability to form 4 bonds. That allows carbon to be this building block. So let's look at why that is. So here we go. This is a chance for a little bit of practice thinking about our periodic table. So remember, oh, where's my pen? Right, this number in the top left corner indicates the atomic number. And if you recall, that's the number of protons, right? And then down here, this is our atomic mass. I don't think I'm going to be able to write it out. Mass. Okay, so with this information, we already know an awful lot about an element. So if I was going to draw carbon, and if you were going to draw carbon, how many protons would you have? If you said 6, you were correct, and those should all go in the nucleus of our atom. So I'll just draw 6 little positives here for our protons, right? Because the atomic number is the number of protons. Now the atomic mass is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. And so since we come out averaging out at around 12, we know we've got 6 more neutrons to add. Oh, into the nucleus here. 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm actually a better artist on the whiteboard. Okay, so if you have 6 protons, you would expect there also to be 6 electrons, unless you're dealing with an ion, which we're not. Okay, so for that first electron shell, how many electrons should I put in there? 2, very good. The first shell can hold 2 electrons, and that means I need another shell. Oh boy. Now this is the outer shell, often referred to as the valence shell. And so there's our remaining 4, right? So we're up to 6 electrons. So there are 4 electrons in the outer shell of carbon, or what we call the valence shell. And it's really this electron configuration, particularly in the valence shell, that is key to an atom's characteristics, right? It determines the kinds and numbers of bonds that an atom will form with its neighbors. And so this is really important in how carbon works. And so here's a few kind of simple organic molecules. See, notice they actually all have carbon and hydrogen. Okay. Basically, when you have these 4 valence electrons, you can make some different shapes. These are just simple ones. Notice you get this tetrahedral pattern when each of those is a single bond. In this bottom molecule down here, we actually have a carbon-carbon double bond, right? Those 2 carbons are, you see a bond here and a bond here. They're sharing 2 pairs of electrons, and that'll actually make things more planar. Anyway, those are some simple organic molecules. But what we'll see is these are the main players, right? And you saw this when you made your pie chart in chapter 2, right? Some of these major elements that make up life. So we have carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen. Now look at all of these. Here's our carbon with its 4 valence electrons. These other atoms are carbon's friends, right? it will nicely form covalent bonds with things like nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen because of how many electrons they have in that valence shell as well. So here's an example of carbon dioxide, right? This is a, move myself out of your way. This is a gas that we are familiar with. Oddly enough, they chose this as an example. Carbon dioxide is not an organic molecule. Don't worry about it. Okay, but notice what happens here. So here's our carbon, our 2 electrons in that inner shell, right? Electron, electron, and carbon also then had 4 electrons. We'll pick these 4 in its outer shell. Okay, oxygen, whose atomic number is 8, and you can go back and check that in your periodic table. The atomic number is 8, and so here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 electrons in the outer shell. How many does it want? 8, right? Every molecule wants to have a full, every atom wants to have a full valence shell. And so what we're going to do is we're going to share this pair of electrons and this pair of electrons, and that's why you see this written as a double bond, right? Each of those lines indicates a shared pair of electrons. All right, moving on. But now we can get more complex, and I'm in the way again. You can get more complex, right? And this is what makes carbon so special. So you can have different linear forms of molecules, right? And they're talking about this as a carbon skeleton. It's like the backbone of a lot of different molecules, right? And that can vary on length. They're showing the branching. So here, butane and isobutane, they're actually isomers. They have the same molecular formula, but notice this one has a branch, right? So that makes a totally different molecule. You can change, notice here, 1-butane, the double bond is between the first set of carbons, hence the 1. Here, the carbon bond is between the second set, right? So you can move where that double bond position is, and those molecules act very differently. And then this is where it gets super wild, right? Carbon can actually form these rings. You don't have to memorize any of these molecules, by the way. Just want you to understand how unique and powerful carbon is. And it all comes back to those 4 valence electrons. Okay. If you've heard of hydrocarbons, right? So you think about gasoline that you put in your car, right? Or oil. This is a hydrocarbon. They're organic molecules that really only have carbon and hydrogen. So say a carbohydrate, for example, actually has a lot of oxygen in it as well. But things like lipids in your body or lipids in those dinosaurs that died and were compressed, right, and became gasoline for your car, it's really dominated by just carbon and hydrogen. Now, that works really nicely in your car as a fuel because it can undergo a reaction and release a large amount of energy to propel you down the road. And it also works really nicely in our bodies. We can store a large amount of energy in a fairly small molecule so that we can carry out life's processes. Okay, let's see. Isomers. So this is kind of a neat, I think I mentioned isomers earlier, right? They have the same molecular formula, but they have different structures. And what's key to understand is when you have a different structure, you're going to have different properties. And so here they're just trying to show you 3 different ways that this happens, right? And so we have an example like we saw earlier where one version is branched and the other isn't. That's considered a structural isomer, right? So it has a different arrangement. Cis-trans isomers, this will be important actually in our next chapter when we talk about things like trans fatty acids. It's actually referring to this chemical level of an isomer. So the way I think about this, right, so the difference here is we have a double bond. You only have cis and trans isomers when there's a double bond. And notice in the cis isomer, these 2 other atoms are on the same side, right? Like if you had a sister, you'd be on the same side, right? You're on the same team, same side. Trans isomers then, notice that the other atom is kind of coming in at these different angles. Okay, that'll be important when we get into lipids, so make sure you keep an eye on that. And then the last one, and this is wild, it's a type of isomer called an enantiomer. enantiomer. You can say it with me, or Home Alone, right? Go for it. Basically, what we're looking at here is their mirror images. And so I really like this example that they use of hands, right? And so if you just looked at these molecules, right, you'd say they're the same thing, right? But you and I both know you couldn't put the same glove on the other hand. It doesn't work. And so this actually becomes really important when you're doing things like making pharmaceuticals. So you're going through this process to make this fairly complex synthetic molecule, right? A chemist is actually building this through a series of reactions. Well, you might get both enantiomers. And so they're trying to point out here, for example, that ibuprofen, only one of those enantiomers is actually effective. Same with albuterol. That's like an inhaler. One enantiomer is effective and the other doesn't actually help you. And this deals with the extreme specificity of some of the receptors inside of our body, but usually it turns out that only one isomer is actually biologically active. There's a wild example you guys may not have heard about. There's a chemical called thalidomide. It was given in the 1950s, so none of us were alive, right? But it was given for morning sickness, and it turns out that one of the enantiomers actually caused really terrible birth defects. So there were about 10,000 babies that were born essentially without arms or legs. A lot of them didn't really survive past birth. And that's kind of when people realized, wow, we need to pay attention to pharmaceuticals down to this level of control. So anyway, an interesting example, I think. Okay. So this is, it's like, what am I doing? What we'll see in a lot of these molecules, again, is this extreme specificity. So this is trying to show you, we have two hormones here, estradiol, which is the most common estrogen, so a female hormone, and testosterone. And notice that a lot of these chains look really similar. And I will point out, chemists kind of cheat. So anytime you see a couple lines coming together like that, there's actually a carbon there. So each of these intersections, you can know, right, that there's a carbon. And here, there's a carbon double bonded to another carbon, which is bonded to a carbon, right? And so that's just a shorthand, how they're doing that. So female hormones, male hormones, they look really similar, right? In fact, you might notice that there's actually just a couple small changes, and they've already highlighted that for you. And so this, you have this carbon skeleton, and then these chemical groups that kind of hang off of it, or often we'll talk about functional groups, and that can make a big difference in how they act. So these are those chemical groups. And some of their properties. So these, again, are the components of an organic molecule that are most commonly involved in chemical reactions. They're kind of like hanging off the side, and so they get involved in reactions. And the arrangement of these functional groups and what exactly is attached there gives each molecule its unique properties. You don't have to memorize these in this class, right? If you go on into like a cell biology or a biochemistry class, you absolutely will. But I just want to point out a few of these. So this hydroxyl group. So anytime you see this OH, that's considered a hydroxyl. It's a polar molecule, right? And you might picture it being just like water. Oxygen is hogging the electrons from this hydrogen. And this is actually present in alcohol, right? So in ethanol, you'd find a lot of this functional group. This one's called a carbonyl, so it's a carbon double bonded to an oxygen there. You might recognize acetone, that's nail polish remover, right? So just having this functional group can definitely change what a molecule is capable of. Carboxyl group, so here we have so notice it says COOH, that carbon is double bonded to this oxygen, so there's a CO, and there's our OH. And basically the carboxyl group acts as an acid. Recall the definition of an acid from our last chapter? It's willing to donate a hydrogen. And so here we see basically this hydrogen popping off, right? Terrible arrow, sorry. So that's a carboxyl group. It often acts as an acid. The amino group, you'll see this in proteins, right? The amino acids. Here we have a nitrogen bonded to two separate hydrogens. And this amino group often acts as a base. A base is willing to accept hydrogens. And so here we see this hydrogen floating around. Our amino group is willing to take it, right? So now our nitrogen has 3 different hydrogens attached, right? All of these little side groups, these functional groups, change how these molecules act. Sulfhydryl group. So we haven't talked much about sulfur, but this ends up being really important in proteins. We'll talk about it more in the next chapter. So this sulfhydryl group, you have a sulfur attached to a hydrogen, and we'll see this in proteins. A lot of times the way they kind of fold has to do with interactions between these sulfur groups. The methyl group. So methyl, you should think methane. So here you see CH3, right? This is one of the craziest things. When we get into genetics, we will see that the addition of this methyl group onto something like DNA can cause disease, can totally change things. So they're talking a lot now about DNA methylation, the addition of these methyl groups during your lifetime, and how you may actually pass that on to your offspring. It gets wild. It's a whole field of biology called epigenetics. So we'll get there later in the semester. Okay, phosphate group. This is one you will see a ton. Definitely want to pay attention to this. Here you have an oxygen attached to a phosphate, which has 3 more oxygens, right? So that's a phosphate. One of the most important places, and I shouldn't say that, you will see a lot of places in biology where these phosphate groups are added and taken off, and it like activates enzymes and things like that. So it becomes super important. The place you will absolutely see this the most is a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. There's 1, 2, 3. Adenosine triphosphate. This is a molecule that hopefully a lot of you guys remember as ATP. Notice what happens here. Notice that you have these negative charges on the phosphate. Okay, so when you have adenosine, say diphosphate, right? Maybe you only have 2 of these phosphate groups on, and you want to add a third. They're both negatively charged molecules, and just like trying to push like 2 magnets together that are the same end, it doesn't work, right? They're like repelled. And so what organisms do is they actually, through eating food and breaking down molecules, they have the energy to put those together. And so in ATP, it's like you've loaded this spring, and then you can actually release that energy again. So ATP is the cellular currency of energy, and to release that energy, to use that energy, we pop a phosphate off, and now we have adenosine diphosphate, or ADP. We'll talk about this more as well. But anyway, this phosphate group is super important. Okay, so when we think about this role of carbon in life, right? Again, key takeaways here, the versatility of carbon, right? Having those 4 valence electrons allows it to make a huge variety of biologically important molecules. And really, this variation all the way down at this molecular level is really important in the foundation of all biological diversity. So there we go, being very reductionist. If we can bring this down to carbon and how its electrons interact with other atoms, we can understand something about life. And don't worry, we'll start putting it back together and look at the big picture as well. All right, we'll see you guys in class.